Okay guys, today we're going to talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine system are the organs and glands in our body that are going to allow us to maintain our internal environment. The function of the endocrine system is responsible for regulating and maintaining all the processes going on internally in our bodies. It includes the integration and regulation of our growth and development, and it also controls our sexual reproduction. Major organs of the endocrine glands secrete hormones into our bloodstreams. And each of those hormones have target cells. They have receptors on these cells for the hormones so they can sense these signals coming to them. And again, we're talking about maintenance. We want to maintain a constant balance in our internal environment. This image is a classic example of how endocrine hormones are released. I do want to make a note of caution that not all hormones get released this way, but a lot do. For example, the neurohormones, the cell, the neuron is going to release the hormone into the bloodstream, and it's going to travel through the bloodstream until it reaches its target cell. Once it's at its target cell, the hormone binds with the receptor, and then that target cell will react to receiving the hormone. There's also another type called paracrine hormones. Paracrine hormones are going to be cells that are right next to each other, and so one cell releases a hormone that acts on a cell right adjacent to it, right next to it. There's a third type called autocrine hormones. Autocrine hormones are going to release hormones out into the environment, and the hormones released are going to act on the cell that actually released that hormone. And then the fourth type and the last type of hormones that I'm going to talk about are the endocrine hormones. And so these hormones don't get released into the environment. They actually will act within the cell itself to signal some type of internal cell reaction. Now, the endocrine organs are known as glands because they produce a secretion. Endocrine glands are going to release hormones, and exocrine glands are going to release secretions into ducts. So those are going to be like our sweat glands, our digestive glands, and so they're going to get rid of waste. The endocrine system has this top-down organization. So you start up in the brain, and in the brain there's the hypothalamus, which produces factors that stimulate our pituitary, which acts on endocrine glands. Now, the pituitary hormones, they're synthesized in neurons and our actual neuronal cell bodies that we talked about in the last lecture. And so in the cell bodies of those neurons, which are in the hypothalamus, they're released via the pituitary and on down into the endocrine glands. And these can include hormones like oxytocin and any type of antidiuretic, and there are a whole bunch of other hormones that are involved in this process. Today we're going to be looking at specific organs. We're going to be looking at the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, our thyroid and parathyroid, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and the ovary and testes. And like I said, the endocrine system is organized so that it is the top-down kind of function. We're going to start at the very top and work our way down to the ovary and testes. The only thing this image does not show is our hypothalamus. And our hypothalamus actually sits above the pituitary gland. It's going to be right up in this area, and it's going to control the pituitary. The hypothalamus itself actually controls the pituitary gland. And it does this by releasing hormones that either inhibit it or they release hormones that allow the pituitary to release its hormones. And so certain types of inhibiting hormones include somatostatin and then prolactin release inhibiting hormone, or known as PIH. And hormones that are going to trigger the release of other hormones are going to be thyrotropin, or also known as TRH, and then growth hormone releasing hormone. And so these are going to control the pituitary gland. And overall, the hypothalamus is really worried about regulating such things as like body temperature, blood pressure, respiration, heartbeat. And so the cells that actually release these hormones, they're called neurosecretory cells. These cells, these neurons, they are connected to the pituitary, and specifically the posterior pituitary. And so all these secretions that get released, all the hormones, they're going to release and trigger a release of something else. The entire pituitary gland is actually responsible for production and releasing 9 major hormones. Now, these 9 major hormones are hormones that are going to control and the release of other hormones. So, the pituitary gland is acting as almost a mastermind for the other endocrine glands and other endocrine organs. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is the brains of the entire operation. Excuse my pun. In this diagram, what you guys are seeing are several different structures of the brain, including where the hypothalamus, pituitary glands, and all that are located. So our hypothalamus is located up in this region. Pituitary gland is down here. And so you're also seeing the pineal glands. The pineal glands are going to be associated with regulating our sleep cycle. So it's responsible for regulating a hormone called melatonin. And that's going to regulate our circadian rhythms. Also, the pineal gland has been correlated with also regulating when we come to sexual maturity at puberty. It reduces the amount of melatonin, and that's when children begin to going through puberty. As you continue down, you get to the brain stem. The brain stem is connected of 2 parts. You have the pons. The pons is the upper part of the brain stem. And with the pons, it's mainly there to connect the thalamus, which would be located up in this region, with the medulla oblongata. And the pons, it's generally associated with generating dreams, and it's also been implicated in sleep paralysis. The medulla oblongata is the lower half of the brainstem down here, and it's part of our autonomic nervous system. So it's responsible for controlling things like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and so it's connecting to the spinal cord. And also you guys see over here is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a region of the brain that's responsible for mainly controlling our motor functions. There's been some involvement noted with attention, language, so cognitive functions, pleasure, fear responses, but motor learning and motor responses are going to be the main thing associated with the cerebellum. The reason I showed this photo, it's just closer up, the hypothalamus, again located up here with the neurosecretory cells, and then those neurosecretory cells connect down into our posterior pituitary. This diagram is to show you that there is 2 divisions to the pituitary. You have a posterior pituitary and an anterior pituitary controlling the entire pituitary structure. The reason they divide this up is the posterior and anterior are involved in regulating and releasing different hormones for different functions. The posterior pituitary is involved in producing 2 hormones. One is an antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, or vasopressin. And this hormone is stimulated by a rise in electrolytes. So its whole purpose is to reduce water loss in our urine. And how it does that is it causes the kidneys to reabsorb the water. It also increases our thirst, so we're going to try to hydrate. And the second hormone is oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions. It stimulates milk delivery and the release of milk in nursing mothers. It's also responsible for stimulating prostate gland and smooth muscle semen production. There's maybe some other things that are going on in the males, but no one really knows for sure everything that's involved. The anterior pituitary is going to produce the other 7 hormones. And so these other 7 hormones are going to include follicle stimulating hormone, which is known as FSH, luteinizing hormone, LH. These control the growth development function of our gonads. Specifically, FSH is responsible for stimulating estrogen secretion, egg production in females, and also sperm production in males. Luteinizing hormone is responsible for triggering ovulation and also progestin production in females. It prepares the female's bodies for pregnancy, and it's also responsible for androgen production in males. TSH is known as thyroid stimulating hormone. And so it's responsible for stimulating the thyroid, and it's going to trigger the release of thyroid hormones, specifically the thyroid hormones T3 and T4. The ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. It stimulates the actual release of glucocorticoid from the adrenal gland, and it affects our glucose metabolism. Growth hormone, or probably what you guys think of as human growth hormone, HGH, it's also known as somatotropin. It's responsible for stimulating growth and protein synthesis in the body. It does this by stimulating cell growth via hormones that get released from the liver. Most of the time, human growth hormone, it stimulates all cells, but it especially targets bone and muscle cells. Prolactin actually stimulates the mammary glands in females and is involved in development and milk secretion. Lastly is the melanocyte-stimulating hormone, MSH. MSH is a peptide hormone, and it's responsible for the release of melanin from melanocytes in our skin and hair. And an increase in MSH can actually cause a darkening in humans. MSH is also known to signal the brain, and it has effects on appetite and even sexual arousal. Different levels of MSH are not the major cause of racial variation in our skin colors. However, in people who don't tan well, there seems to be some type of variation in hormone receptors that cause them not to respond to MSH in our blood. This diagram is demonstrating from the pituitary gland how many different organs are being controlled from that one area. And so let's look at specifically where each hormone that's released from the pituitary is going to act upon. Here is a very simple diagram showing the target organs of our anterior pituitary. Luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone are both going to stimulate the gonads. Thyroid-stimulating hormone is responsible for stimulating the thyroid gland. ACTH, responsible for stimulating the adrenal gland. MSH, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, stimulates the skin cells. And then prolactin is going to stimulate the mammary glands. The endocrine system, there's a whole control mechanism to it. For one, the endocrine system is responsible for sense and signaling. There's a biological need that gets sensed. The endocrine system is going to send out a signal to the target cell, whose action addresses the biological need. Once that biological need is met, we no longer need to be sending out that signal. We need to shut down that signal. And so the endocrine system is controlled by what we call a negative feedback mechanism. An increase in a substance inhibits production of another substance. So once you've met that biological need, you've got that biological need secreted another chemical, or you've completely reached a level, we need to then tell the endocrine system to turn off. We don't need these signals. It's similar to a heater. You say, okay, it's too cold in here, so you increase the temperature on the thermostat to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the actual temperature in the room rises to 70 degrees, the thermostat tells the heater that it needs to shut off. Very simple diagram showing what happens. Hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary gland. Once the pituitary gland gets stimulated, it's going to release ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex is then going to release the hormone cortisol. That is then going to stimulate back and say, hey, we've already released the cortisol, we've acted, we've met our biological need, it's time to shut off. And when that does, it will stop the production of CRF and ACTH, so we do not continue to go down the path. Let's take a look at another example. Specifically, we're going to look at the thyroid and iodine. Iodine is going to be found in trace amounts in our diet. Our bodies do not synthesize it, so we do need to intake it in food that we eat. And iodine is used by our thyroid glands to help make the hormones T3 and T4. In doing this, once you've got these hormones, these help regulate our metabolism, development of our skeleton and brain, among other many different things. Now, when we get enough iodine and our body is functioning properly, the hypothalamus is going to release thyroid-releasing hormone. This is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary, which is going to then release TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone. This, along with the iodine in the thyroid, is going to produce the hormones T3 and T4. Once T3 and T4 is produced, these go back and they are going to shut down the anterior pituitary and shut down the hypothalamus. We have enough, we're done. However, in the case when we don't get enough iodine in our diet or there's another type of disease happening, what happens is that the hypothalamus releases the TRH, stimulates the anterior pituitary, which releases the TSH, and this, along with these small amounts of iodine that we're receiving, are going to make small amounts of T4. This is not enough, we're not producing enough, so then this feedback mechanism is not happening. We're not shutting down. So we continue to make TRH and TSH and continue to make T4. And so this is going to continue over and over, and there's going to be an excess buildup. And so therefore our pathway is never going to shut down. It's being overstimulated. This can actually have a dramatic and detrimental effect on the health of an individual. Now let's look at the two major classes of hormones. These are divided into steroids and protein hormones. Steroid hormones are going to be released from the adrenal glands, our gonads, and steroid proteins are typically hydrophobic. Because they're hydrophobic, they can get into a cell very easily, they bind to a receptor, can migrate to the nucleus. All steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. The protein hormones are going to be typically released from the pituitary, the pancreas, and so these are going to be hydrophilic. They're very large, typically can't fit through a membrane, and so these are going to be examples like insulin. And protein hormones, they are water soluble and they comprise probably the largest number of hormones. Some say that they sometimes range in the thousands of hormones. Proteins bind to a receptor in the membrane and it triggers a secondary reaction. It can trigger the formation of what we call cyclic AMP from ATP, and then cyclic AMP causes the cell to react in some way. Here's a diagram of how a steroid hormone is going to act. The steroid is going to get through the cell membrane, it's going to bind with a receptor protein, which will then migrate into the nucleus, and this hormone receptor complex will stimulate a reaction. Here, they're stimulating the transcription and translation of a section of DNA, so we're looking at a gene getting transcribed, taking that to mRNA, that mRNA gets translated into a new protein. And this diagram is going to show you an example of how a protein hormone works. Protein is this signal molecule out here. It binds to a receptor. It sends off this reaction inside the cell. So we have this reaction going on. It makes cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is then going to signal another type of pathway to go on, and then this might go in and target transcription and translation of a certain gene. So protein hormones have more of a longer pathway, a longer roundabout way to sometimes do similar reactions. The last type of hormone I really want to talk about are the prostaglandins. And so these prostaglandins, they are going to be triggered, and then these hormones get released, but they don't get released into the bloodstream. They're going to be released locally, and they're going to act on the cells specifically around them. And so they're going to have effects like things like muscle contractions, pains, things that happen in a centralized region versus overall. And so guys, this ends the notes over endocrine system. Make sure you add a summary at the very end, and I will see you guys in class.